Good afternoon and welcome to the Department of Community Affairs Technical Assistant Workshop. Today we will be talking about resources that are available to communities and providers that are tools assembled by the GBDI team. The mission of the Georgia Broadband Deployment Initiative has to bring broadband services to unserved areas of Georgia. The barriers created for deployment have been related to cost, due to low population density and rugged terrain. We see that the key solution is through public-private partnerships with broadband service providers. We see them as part of the key solution due to the expertise in design, build, operations, and maintenance, and certainly the capital that they can bring to these solutions for long-term sustainability. This also allows for maximizing investment of public funds and reducing the risk. Why is this important? The pandemic has highlighted how essential broadband is for businesses and education, healthcare, really the whole economic ecosystem. The Georgia Broadband Availability Map has shown us that more than 1 million Georgians lack access to reliable high-speed internet service. In order to protect their health as well as the safety of the others, all across Georgia, many citizens have been working from home and educating through remote learning and utilizing many other online services. Those that have had internet access has transitioned seamlessly, but those without access to internet connectivity have struggled. The COVID pandemic has led to many funding opportunities for the expansion of broadband services at the local, federal, and state levels. Across the last couple of years, we have been working with a broad project team that has consisted of multiple agencies. DCA has led the project team with GTA, GDOT, States Property Commission, the Department of Economic Development, and the University System CDIOG. Through that, we have augmented resources across multiple agencies to develop tools and resources that we can bring to communities to support them as they look for broadband expansions for their communities. Today's panelists include myself, Dina Perry, Bill Price, IT strategist from the Georgia Technology Authority, Eric McRae from the University of Georgia's CDIOG Information Technology Outreach Services. We've also included Andrew Afflerbach with CTC Technology and Energy. He brings 25 years of experiences in consulting on broadband technology nationally and internationally. The purpose of the technical assistance webinar today is because there is lots of funding, as I mentioned earlier, through federal programs in response to COVID, as well as money that will flow to state and local levels in addition to state funding. It is important for us all to combine and coordinate efforts to make smart decisions on why and how and with whom we should invest these public resources. We're in the process of rolling out a state grant program, the details of which will be shared in a notice of funding availability. However, the purpose of this workshop is to outline the tools and resources available to communities and consider specific projects to provide services to unserved areas. As you can see through the agenda, we'll talk about expertise, the data, tools, how to define an unserved area, broadband project planning, as well as the state of Georgia's grant program. We'll also offer a live Q&A at the end, but we do encourage you to put your questions in the chat box along the presentation. In understanding how to bring broadband services to your community, the one place to start is understanding where those unserved are. We have worked across the last couple of years developing a statewide map, identifying where the services exist, but more importantly, where those services do not exist. When we refer to access, we are referring to whether or not a home, business, residence has access to a minimum of a 25/3 down and a 3 upload service. We'll also talk about technology options. One of the things that you will hear and see is what are the technologies that are available to a community. Is it a fiber to the home service? Is it a fixed wireless service? And we will talk about and familiarize you with the different technology options. We'll also talk about project investment, return on investment. As I mentioned earlier, cost is the number one barrier to expanding to rural areas. We'll talk about things that will be considered in evaluating the return on an investment and why it's important to take into consideration these different components and elements as you evaluate an investment to these unserved areas. We'll also talk about how to identify and qualify partners. As I mentioned earlier, we think that one of the most important solutions is working with our public-private partnerships of our broadband service providers across the state. We'll talk about how you can identify and qualify those partners. Now I'd like to turn it over to Eric McRae. He will talk about the mapping effort that we've done across the state for the past couple of years and how to utilize this as a tool and resource.
Thank you, Dina. So one of the first things we have to understand is why we went and undertook this mapping project in the first place. And one of the key things we have to think about is how does the FCC map data for broadband nationally? Well, for the FCC, all broadband providers are required to file twice a year through a form called 477 whether or not they offer internet service at 200 kilobytes and at least one direction to any location. If they offer that service in a single location, then that census block is considered served. So in this example of this census block that we see here, as long as they serve one of these dots in this census block, that entire census block is considered served. And so what we found was that a large majority of the census blocks in the state of Georgia were showing up as being served, but in reality, they weren't really heavily served. And so what would have a situation is we would have a census block with, let's say, 25 locations and 3 of them were served, and that census block was considered served. 22 of those locations were unserved. And so as Dina mentioned earlier, in order to be considered broadband in the state of Georgia, it is 25 megs down and 3 megs up of speed. It was also a requirement in the state of Georgia that we were only looking at terrestrial broadband. So in the state of Georgia, when 20% of the homes and businesses in a census block cannot subscribe to those services, the entire census block is deemed unserved. And that's a huge distinction. And so we have a stark difference in the state of Georgia. So you see here, the map on the left is the FCC map. The orange areas are all the served locations in the state, and the yellow areas are all the unserved locations in the state. When you look at our location level approach, using the same color scheme, orange is served and yellow is unserved. The map on the right shows you a very different outlook of what we have in the state of Georgia. And when all is said and done, we have over 507,000 locations which are unserved. 70% of those unserved locations are rural. 31% of the entire state of Georgia, rural state of Georgia, is unserved. 26 counties have greater than 50% unserved. That's a huge difference compared to what the FCC says. So I'm going to show you here in a second a demonstration of what maps we have available on the website, but I also wanted to point out real quickly that we have all the mapping data available to you. So if you have a GIS shop in-house, you can pull this data in and do your own analysis. We have the data available as web mapping services. We have the data in the spreadsheet format as CSV. And we also have the data as a shapefile. And this is all statewide data, but you can drill down to the individual census block using this information. An example of what you can do with this information is you can create an unserved reference map that shows you the entire state of Georgia and all the unserved locations and come up with your own density maps using the same information. This is all available on the website right now. Right now, I'm going to show you a quick demo of what we have for maps in the state of Georgia. So on the broadband website, we have a tab which is called Maps. Under the maps, we have multiple tabs that show you different information. I'm going to start off with a comparison of the FCC versus the state of Georgia's findings. Here we have orange is served and yellow is unserved. As we slide this slider bar across, you can see all the orange disappearing, and that turns into unserved areas. This is this is the difference between the FCC map and the GBDI map in the state of Georgia. We wanted to look at this information by an individual county. We can come in here and we can go through and we can reference a county. We can just search for a county. So I can put in Lowndes. I can zoom to Lowndes County, and that will show me that Lowndes County is 27% unserved. We have 14,994 unserved locations, and we have 41,328 served locations. If I continue to zoom in, I'll actually see individual information for individual census blocks, and I can get detailed information about those census blocks. I can also look at this map and look at it for different geographies and do queries against different geographies. So I was interested in looking at it from a House legislative district. I can basically select any legislative district. I'll just select one here, do 51. That'll take me into a district. This one looks like it's very heavily served. So 2% of this district is unserved, but there are pockets even within this district which are actually unserved. As we zoom in a little bit closer, we can get that detailed information for that individual district to show that in this case, this census block is 36% unserved within this district. We also work putting together a public Wi-Fi map, and this shows you all the free public Wi-Fi locations that were identified by the state and where their availability is. And so in this case, in Putnam County, we have 105 Oak Street. It's a McDonald's, and this was identified as a free public Wi-Fi location. And this is the case all across the state. Here's an example of the Winterville Library. And we have notes in there such as the password is posted at the entrance so that you can get that information. This was extremely important during the pandemic when kids were sent home from school and didn't have the ability to access broadband from home. They were able to use this information to go and find locations so they have access to broadband to do their homework. And as I said earlier, we have all of the map data is available online through the website. I'll go ahead and turn it back over to you, Dina.
At this time, Bill Price will talk about the return on investment and how we can support understanding investments in technologies.
Thank you, Dina. Yep, I'm Bill Price. I'm with the Georgia Technology Authority, and today we're going to touch on information that we have about infrastructure, investing in broadband infrastructure, elements of that, identifying capital gaps, and how the partnership of government and providers can come together. Andrew from CTC, one of the firms we've contracted with to assist the program, is going to go through some technology options and decisions as it impacts investment evaluation and decision-making capabilities and costs. We're going to talk about partnerships, how to identify them, evaluate them, getting into contracts. We're going to talk about projects and how to look at them to evaluate them for potential investment, looking at, qualifying the areas, quantifying the data that you need, doing the analysis and the tools and the assistance resources the state brings to engage with providers and local governments, and then a little bit about, how do we measure success or failure, right? So in this slide, I'm just illustrating that we do have an opportunity that we didn't have before COVID, really, where there's a lot more money that's available to consider investing in partnerships with providers, and broadband infrastructure is capital intensive. And so the question is what are the ways which we all might consider doing investments together to share risk and reward to meet our goals and objectives? Planning for broadband infrastructure has parallels to other infrastructure investments that government and the private sector has made together, whether it's transportation or electric or gas or water or sewer. So the folks in the local government side, a lot of these concepts should be familiar when you're thinking about infrastructure investments. One difference is that, in broadband infrastructure, there is competition. There is shorter term return on investment expectations versus governments looking at infrastructure investments where we tend to look at a longer term return or objective achieved. But, we do have this opportunity to bring support funding through joint investment to make it happen and expand broadband where it's not today. In Georgia, there's over 44 retail internet service providers that are already investing in much of the state that, The served area represents where they're providing service today. So the program, GBDI, we've assembled over the last couple of years a significant amount of information and data. And Eric was showing you tools that the UGA Carl Vinson Institute team of government has developed. And our goal, of course, is how do we invest economically and efficiently to expand broadband availability and use, balancing some risk over a longer period of time. Now, of course, providers and consultants in the marketplace, they range anywhere from very qualified with lots of resources, experience, and expertise in this space with proven capabilities and scale. And then you're going to find that there are newcomers who do bring resources. And then there's going to be newcomers with limited resources, and all the way down to you'll probably be approached by folks who are really not very qualified because there is somewhat of a gold rush in place and in play, given there's so much government funding now becoming available for this area. And of course, providers, their goal in investment decision making is to maximize revenue and profit. They tend to be risk averse, and if there's not a great degree of confidence in a return on investment over a relatively short period of time, then they're not going to be so agreeable to make those investments. So part of what we all need to be aware of and understand is federal funding and the impacts of the federal funding to the state of Georgia. There's a significant amount of money through the Rural Digital Opportunities Fund program run by the FCC. Recently, they announced the preliminary awards and the award areas and the number of locations funded and the amounts and who it's going to. So we all need to be mindful of the areas that are covered. The green in this illustration shows you the areas where RDOF was available, and it was most all of it was awarded, 179 out of 181,000 locations. The other point here is that there still are a significant number of Georgia residential and business locations that still remain unserved, even if you set aside the entire RDOF. And I believe it is the state's position at this moment, for at least getting started, that only the remaining unserved census blocks and locations are going to be eligible for the GBDI grant program. So in this slide, we're showing you some of the numbers that are in the award, in the initial award through the RDOF. All these companies, 15 companies in total, if they are successful and they actually build out to all the locations, will receive $326 million in support. That's what the federal government calls it. They call it support for 179,000 locations. The rural electric co-ops through consortiums and partnerships bid on and were awarded 60,000. It was the single, largest number of locations. Windstream was second to that, and Charter was third. We do have the information on all 15. SpaceX, which is a unique new satellite technology, low Earth orbit satellite, which has the potential to do greater, faster speeds and lower latency performance than high Earth orbit satellites, was awarded a fairly substantial amount of locations in the state of Georgia. And right now, all of this is still going through a process they call the long form process, where the FCC staff is evaluating all the companies, their bids, what they propose, going through lots of details, information exchange. And it could take many months, maybe even further than a year, before they issue the final awards. So we'll have to track and pay attention to what is going on with this. And the amounts, these support amounts, are actually paid out on a monthly basis over a 10-year period of time. What this slide is showing you is the speeds that the bidders promise to deliver to these locations. And really the significant part about this for me, and I think for all of us, is that a lot of fiber to the home, a lot of hybrid fiber coax, infrastructure investment will need to take place to satisfy, these high speeds. This was kind of surprising, but it is what the bidders propose to do. This slide is showing the timeline expectations of the awarded companies. They have to hit 100% service build out to all the locations that they were funded by year 6. This is a relatively long period of time, but it is what the schedule requires of them. It is yet to be seen how much of this will be finalized and real and awarded, and it is yet to be seen how successful these 15 companies will be in actually building these out. So there is some uncertainty about RDOF at this point, but we are going to track it very closely and keep up with it. So on this slide, we want to talk a little bit about broadband infrastructure and the capital part of it that we're anticipating that government would be funding jointly with providers. Of course, you have the internet itself, the global internet, and then that comes down to the state and kind of like interstates, long haul networks, fiber networks, and then you have middle mile components of the network to reach the endpoints, which is kind of like state roads. And then you have the last mile, which is you're into the neighborhoods. And then you have the actual drop, what we call the drop and the drop cost, which is really from the street entrance to the structure that is somewhere on a piece of property. Could be a tiny piece of property, could be a piece of property that's 500 acres. But broadband service availability, its capability and performance is depending on investment decisions that are driven by planning requirements for areas of service, the technologies chosen, the number of potential customer locations, and the income that is derived from people who pay for the service to fund operations, support, and maintenance, and upgrades to maintain and supply a supply-demand equilibrium. So to do effective and accurate broadband investment planning is going to require good data and tools to manipulate the data and the expertise to understand what the data is telling us when we look at a proposed project in a project area from a provider. This slide again is talking about broadband infrastructure investment fundamentals. What do we need to know and use for project planning? Well, thanks in part to the impacts of COVID, we as government and providers now have new opportunity as possible co-investors to go further than any of us might have imagined before COVID. So the focus is on using the state resources, information, and tools that we're talking about to evaluate, possible infrastructure investments, using the standardized set of data that's very accurate, and the tools to take all that data and map it and illustrate it so that we can determine how much risk there is in achieving the objective, evaluating how much each potential investing partner is going to allocate toward a project. This just shows an example where if government funded 50% of the capital, that really only represents 22.5% of the overall investment if we're expecting providers to come up with 50% of the capital and then cover all the rest of the operating costs, sales and marketing, billing, all those costs in the operating expense side. This is just one approach, and depending on the area and the cost per location, we may have to consider increasing how much government is willing to fund. So again, this is just to illustrate, different scenarios. We need to take the data and the tools that we have and plan them out. So on this slide, on the map on the right is showing the served orange, the unserved yellow after RDOF, which is green. But at the end of the day, any proposed project should have, a sustainable cash flow positive capability to sustain itself so that it doesn't require a continued government subsidy or support an amount to keep it going to make sure that service is still being provided to customers. So the business case, if you will, the return on investment, the pro forma is what we would use to achieve, investor confidence to go ahead and make these investments. So we need to all understand as co-investors what the expectations are from the government side, what the expectations are from the provider side to make these investments. We need to look at the investor contribution that I spoke about earlier on the previous slide. And we need to be able to, through the business case evaluation, know are we achieving cost recovery so that at a minimum operating revenues recover operating costs, administrative expenses. We need to make sure that the working capital objective is achieved so that, the project, and whoever's running the network and, the provider who's running the network and providing the service has enough working capital to sustain a level of service and meet, demand with supply, and the positive cash flow. At what point in time can we all agree is acceptable to both very different perspectives of making investment in a broadband project? So I'm going to turn it over to Andrew at CTC, who's going to give you a high-level overview of various broadband infrastructure types and things that we all need to think through that affects how much is required to invest. So Andrew, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Bill. What I want to do today is just provide some information about the range of technologies that's important to give you a high-level view based on our firm's experience, but this webinar is not really a detailed technical tutorial. Some of these technologies are more likely to be used in new networks that may be built in Georgia, in particular fiber to the home and fixed wireless. Some of these are more likely to be existing networks that could be expanded to the adjacent areas, and those in particular are the cable HFC technology, if a cable company is to expand its footprint outside of its area to nearby, the DSL copper technology, which is based on phone lines. The funding reality has really greatly improved with COVID rescue funds. And what this means is that somebody who's considering to build a network or expand broadband in Georgia can expend more funds in upfront capital costs. So if there's a technology that provides better performance, we have the opportunity to future-proof and spend more money on that technology. And if you do so, in many cases, you might also reduce the total lifetime cost. So wireless, for example, may have, in some cases, a lower cost of entry, and in some cases could be built rapidly, but it potentially also has a higher operational cost. And it's also important to understand the future roadmap, because many wireless technologies may have only a 5 to 10 year lifetime of the equipment and have to be replaced wholesale. Meanwhile, fiber cable, in contrast, has decades of life. It can be upgraded without turning a shovel, but with an equipment refresh. And a very low maintenance cost. So that would be a physical network with potentially a very long legacy in front of it. It's also important to know about the new generation of satellite technology, the low Earth orbit that SpaceX is deploying. That's a technology that has promise in many ways, but it's still in the early days of deployment. It's not deployed yet at a large scale. Only dozens of satellites are up out of the thousands that are planned. And the business case is not yet clearly made. It's also important to note that SpaceX is not going to be building a physical network on the ground in Georgia. So what I want to do here is just basically walk through a little bit more detail about these technologies. First thing to note here is that fiber to the premises up at the top. If you look at this deck here, slide here, you have a range of speeds. The low part of the graph is lower speeds, megabits per second. The right hand is higher speeds. So fiber, the technology at the top there, goes all the way off to the right hand side, which are speeds way above 10 gigabits per second. Fiber actually is limited, as I mentioned, by the physical network technology that's connected to the fiber at the ends, but nobody has really put a limit yet on what a strand of fiber can really deliver after you keep upgrading and upgrading the technology. It's also key to note that fiber is foundational to the other technologies you see here. So on a cable TV system, the fiber goes to the last mile or even fraction of a mile to the house, and then the cable TV type physical medium is only the very last part of the system. Likewise, on a phone network, the fiber goes out from the central office, usually in many places out to a cabinet, and then only the last part is the copper cable. Likewise, on a wireless network, fiber goes out to the cell site or the antenna usually. So you look at the other thing to note that's important of this chart is there's always a range of the technologies from left to right here. So if we look at fixed wireless, we have a range here that starts at way down at 100 kilobits per second, goes all the way up to hundreds of megs. And that's to illustrate that a lot of what you're really going to get in a speed is really from a technology is situational. Wireless is going to work better if the antenna is closer to you. It's going to work better if you don't have trees or obstructions along the way. If you have more spectrum that's available to work, in other words, more of the channel space to use. And it's going to work better with more advanced generations of technology. Likewise with mobile, the 4G and 5G. The 5G is generally a more advanced technology using higher frequency spectrum, usually much shorter range signals, and that's part of what gets at the high speeds. Satellite technology is coming into play here, and you see here on the right-hand side here of this satellite band here, the low Earth orbit satellite, the SpaceX satellite that has promise as it gets more and more expanded to maybe give other wireline technologies a run for their money. There's a lot going on here, and again, the thing to emphasize is fiber is foundational to all the technologies, and all of these have a range depending on the specific situation of the network. Often the megabits and kilobits are not something that everybody is conversant with if you're not always working in the technical kind of realm. So I like to compare these technologies with how long does it take to do a certain thing with the technology. So let's say transferring a 5 gigabyte file, which is better known as a movie. If you were to do that using trying to use the previous generation of wireless, the 3G wireless, that could take you 10 hours to download that movie, in addition to the fact that it would eat up all the data that you were allowed to use over the period of a month. The situation gets better when you have a wired network such as the DSL that's used in some environments, the copper network, but it's still hours to download that movie. It gets substantially better when you're looking at a cable technology. You're down to less than 1 minute with the leading edge DOCSIS 3 technology, but with fiber, you're down below a minute. You're down to seconds. And for those who feel that that's kind of maybe not the most mission critical example, a movie, consider how long it takes to do telemedicine, sending an X-ray, and that sort of thing. That's sort of a comparable scenario. So you can see a couple things here again. Fiber and then improved generations of fiber sort of topping the bill here. Upload and download being different speeds, download generally being faster with most of the technologies. So again, your choice is important here, and in many cases, what you're able to do with the availability of rescue funds is invest potentially in the higher end technologies up front. I'll hand it back to Bill.
Yeah, so it's important to note that we did DOE and DCA, GTA, Carl Vinson, and CTC, we partnered up to do a very in-depth analysis and quantified, possible costs and around deploying broadband using fixed wireless capabilities and different spectrum, et cetera. And it's available for anyone who wants to reach out to DCA. We can make the report available. So part of what the program, the GBDI program, has done is we've worked with all the providers, and we've downloaded the FCC's data, which the providers file, and so we do know pretty much who all the providers are that provide retail broadband service or are planning to in the state of Georgia, based on RDOF award activities, and we know pretty much where they serve today and where they're close to. And we pretty much know what their qualifications and experience and ability to scale is. So it's good for us and for you, and for everyone, for all of us to know who has these capabilities, who's already made substantial investments over many decades in broadband infrastructure and have the financial and operational expertise and capacity to scale up. There's going to be intense demand put on all the providers and all their suppliers across the entire country, because every state is looking at making substantial investments in expanding broadband. And in Georgia, we have providers who are telecom companies, cable companies, electric co-ops, and there's a small number of city-based providers as well. And we work with all of them. So, we know which companies are receiving the federal USDA grant awards. We know which ones have gotten the Connect America Fund support. We know, like I said, the RDOF awards that are planned, and hopefully all that will go well and they'll succeed in those build outs. But as we look at possible projects to invest, it's important to know, who is close, who has infrastructure either in the area or near the area. This illustration is some of the data that we have by county. And as you can, some counties are going to have, more providers that have some level of investment in them than others. But, when we look at getting competing proposals, these are the likely go-to candidates in a county, for example. So this slide is an illustration of how we might use the mapping tool that Eric and his team has developed for the state, where you can go into an area and you can select census blocks, and then we can export important data that's very accurate, that could be used by the investors to evaluate the details of a proposed project and make changes to it, and recalculate to make sure that we're within a budget. We need to understand that. We need to understand where all the possible subscriber locations that are residential and business and government locations by census block and by county. We need to know all the unserved locations for the same. With our list of providers that we're talking to, that's important for any given area. What contracts already exist that can be leveraged, to pay for and enter into these agreements. Identifying the previous awarded locations, important to know. And so we do have quite a bit of information and tools that's been developed to assist in making good investment decisions. So on this slide, this is just an example of how we can take the data that we've got, we can fill in the blanks. Again, when you drilling down to specific areas for project consideration, we need to know, what the potential investment costs are, what the locations are, the providers, what the capital expense looks like by location, by census block, by area in total. We may want to look at categorizing, groups of locations in low, medium, and high costs. And then we might want to consider going after the low and the medium locations first and the high later, or taking them all on all at once. But anyway, with all this data, we can do lots of good planning. We can pick, the right proposals from providers to partner in the investment. We can make good decisions about, what technology can be afforded to achieve, as Andrew said, kind of a no regrets, future-proof investment versus, well, if we choose a cheaper path for short term, we could find out that, we haven't done the best in making investment decisions.
Thank you, Bill. As many of you know, Governor Kemp is committed to bringing broadband services to the unserved in rural Georgia. In his State of the State address earlier this year, he made recommendations to include $20 million for Y21 fiscal year and then another $10 million for Y22 fiscal year to fund a state grant program. Since then, the budgets have been approved, so that funding has been made available to a current state grant program where the rules and regs were developed over the last couple of years. He continues to look and explore ways to find solutions to bring connectivity to our unserved areas. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit about what's included in that state grant program and provide a little bit of information around that. Okay, so who may apply? To understand who is eligible to apply, I think it would be good to talk about how the program is governed. It is governed by the One Georgia Authority, which is part of DCA. In addition to One Georgia Authority, It also is governed by the policies and procedures of the Department of Community Affairs. As such, any public authority, which is a local development authority or a local government, such as a city or county, that is in a One Georgia eligible or conditionally eligible county may apply for grant funding. Applicants must partner with a qualified provider to deliver the proposed services or the proposed service area. Applicants who partner with a qualified provider will be giving priority consideration and are more competitive applications. It's also important to note that while both eligible and conditional counties both can apply, funding caps for other One Georgia programs do not apply. For those of you who are familiar with One Georgia, we have multiple programs that are funded through that. And based on whether you're an eligible or conditional eligible counties, those programs have caps associated with each. Those do not apply in an application for the state broadband program. So there's two ways that you might select a private partner, a broadband service provider. One is through an approved list. The approved list will be conducted through an RFP that was released on Monday, with the anticipated award date is yet to be determined. As you can see on the screen, qualified providers awarded will be on the approved provider list for the DCA for the grant program. This list will be for those who have gone through the RFP and have been selected through that process. The objective of the RFP is to ensure that there are capable and qualified providers who have met certain criteria who become a part of the list, and you can select as a local government from that list to partner with that provider. Another option is the local procurement process. That is just following your own adopted procurement procedures and policies. Using your local guidelines, you would conduct a competitive and transparent bidding process to select your partner. Again, selecting from the approved provider list, one of the goals and objective is sustainable, feasible projects. So selecting through an approved provider list partner is a competitive advantage within the application evaluation. So how much funding is available? Well, that's dependent upon the annual. As I mentioned earlier, FY21 in the amended year, which is the current year, was $20 million. FY22, $10 million. The match requirement is a minimum of a 50% cash match. Contribution matters in the evaluation process. There is a higher contribution beyond the 50% or higher match. Again, evaluation and the competitiveness would be in favor of those with the higher contribution. What geographic areas are eligible for funding? Any unserved census block identified by the Georgia Broadband Availability Map, which is the map that is published on our website. If you have been deemed as an unserved census block, as Eric mentioned earlier, so your census block is 20% or greater unserved, then that is an eligible census block. Another criteria is it must be an eligible or conditionally eligible One Georgia county. So those counties who are eligible or conditionally eligible to apply for One Georgia funding, those are also part of that. So it must be an unserved census block within a One Georgia county. The grants will be competitively awarded. And there's a note here that I want to emphasize. We will only be funding unserved locations within those unserved census block. So if you have an unserved census block and there's a total of 100 locations, 80 of those locations are unserved, then it would be the 80 unserved locations within that would receive funding. Eric and Bill both touched on this a little bit. As we're developing more of the program mechanics and technical tools to support a grant application, we will be developing through Eric's team at University of Georgia a grant eligibility mapping tool. This will be utilized in the first phase of the application to draw and develop a proposed project service area. Eric, would you like to speak to the eligibility amount, just to give a little bit of background of what we're proposing to do with this tool?
I'd be happy to, Dina. So we're going to build out a tool that's going to enable you as a applicant to go through and select eligible census blocks and build out a list of those census blocks in which you'd like to serve. The only census blocks that you will be presented with, as Dina mentioned earlier, are those census blocks which we are going to be including as part of the grant program. And so we will have already pulled out all the served census blocks, all the census blocks that are funded through RDOF or the USDA Reconnect, or those that are not conditionally eligible or One Georgia eligible. And only the census blocks in which will be available through the grant program will show up. So as you can see here in this illustration, we also show you the number of unserved locations in the census block. And this will allow you as the user to go through and identify those areas in which you can have the most impact. Once you go through, you'll be able to select those census blocks. After you've built up the list of the area that you want to serve, you'll be able to go through and review those in a table format. The table will show you all the total unserved. And at the very bottom of the screen, I realize it's hard to see, it'll actually give you the counts of those, showing you that information. When all is said and done, you're going to be able to export this data out as a table. And this table, then you can basically take that information and submit that as part of your grant application to give us the information that we need to go through and do that final analysis to determine whether or not it's a viable grant application. Back to you, Dina.
Thank you, Eric. Part of this scoring evaluation is also based on being a broadband ready designated community. We've had several counties and cities who have actually applied and have received this designation. The two criterias for meeting the designation requirements is the adoption of a model ordinance, and then also the adoption of a local comprehensive plan that has broadband service elements. As you can see, you can go to our website. There's an application process in which you submit your application. You would upload the model ordinance document that has been adopted by your community, and also confirm and certify that your local comprehensive plan does include that element and it is up to date based on the legislative requirements. Part of this designation is to demonstrate and illustrate the commitment by the community that you have recognized and that you do have efforts within your community to bring service to the unserved portions of your county. It also promotes community planning for both the present and the future. As I just mentioned, it's a good way to illustrate that you have a stakeholder group in your community that has recognized the need and understands the importance to economic development and the quality of life of your citizens who are currently unserved but would like to have a more robust service, and the need to do that in order to utilize all the options that are available online. The application, again, is on our website. While this designation is part of the evaluation, it is not a requirement in order to apply. You can apply for state funds without the designation, but it is part of the evaluation tool. So the grant program and evaluation criteria, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation and the technical assistance webinar, is that the mission of the Georgia Broadband Office is to deploy services to unserved. As such, the Tier 1 criteria is to reach the number of and maximize the number of unserved. The program was designed on 3 principles. Number 1, maximizing and reaching the largest number of unserved locations possible, maximizing public investment, and then minimizing risk. So that's why you see in Tier 2 is a sustainability and feasibility evaluation section of the state program, looking at a qualified provider partner and what those attributes might look like. Again, selection from an approved provider list is a more competitive application. Capital contribution, maximizing the match The minimum match requirement, again, is 50%, but if the contributions are higher, that too lends itself to a more competitive application. And then also project capital cost. Project capital cost, if it's lower by comparison to some other type build out, understanding what goes into that capital cost, what the budget is, what the construction, it is our belief that if these are networks that are leveraging existing assets and existing infrastructure that is already in existence, then the capital cost would be lower. Therefore, we're maximizing state investment in public dollars. We're working with someone who has the ability to bring expertise, capital, design of the network, and just as importantly, or most importantly, can sustain and maintain the network and operations for the longevity of that network. Again, Tier 1, the first gate, is maximizing the number of locations that can be reached within that proposed project. More information will be coming out in the coming weeks regarding the state grant program. We'll be releasing a notice of funding availability, the ANOFA, that will have more specifics and details about the program. So stay tuned for that. To contact us regarding any information or any assistance that we have talked about during this webinar, you can use the local government contact information there. If in fact you're a local government and would like to seek information about the designation or any of the resources and tools that we have discussed, Brittany Hickam, Program Manager for the Broadband Ready designation, you can reach out directly to her for any questions regarding that, and really any questions that you would have, and she can help assist and bring meetings together so that we can discuss any questions. For mapping inquiries, also you can reach out to Jason Sell, who's part of the broadband office and the broadband team. He will be glad to assist you and connect you with the additional resources that we have available through Eric's team, as well as through Bill's team and certainly CTC. As I mentioned, a release of a NOFA will be coming out in the next couple of weeks. We will also have additional webinar workshop series specifically to the grant program. We will be launching the grant eligibility map. Georgia Technology Authority is offering a summit on May 5th that is focused. It's a one-day focused on broadband. We will be sharing any additional information that has developed since this webinar at the GTA Summit. At this time, we'll take any questions and provide answers accordingly.